This video is about some results from a DNA test which I did recently. If you're interested in some of the science behind these tests, have a look at my first video, which I'll link in the top right of this one. First of all, let me say that almost all of my traceable ancestry is from the islands, principally from Lewis and Harris, and that I've seen several other people's profiles done from similar tests and also from the island, and mine's pretty typical. The main profile which I've used below comes from the company Ancestry DNA. This company is the best one to do basic research with if you're from the islands. This is because it splits up British and Irish DNA, and some of the other companies that you can use don't do this. However, you'll see that this is quite important information for islanders. So let's get right to it. Here is the basic breakdown. As you can see, it's roughly about 50% British and 50% Irish. The British component refers to the ancient prehistoric settlers of the British Isles. These were the people who built the Colony Stone Circle, the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, and Stonehenge. This ancient British signal lies at the base of all British peoples, including the English, the Scottish, the Irish and the Welsh. Most islanders that I've seen the profiles of have a component of this somewhere between 30 and 50%. Although the indication given here is 47%, by viewing the amount of uncertainty in this, we can see that it's simply an estimate, and it could actually be anywhere in the range between 28 and 70%. Although, given the data, the figure given around 47% is the most likely, but it could range for a few percent on either side as a reasonable estimate. There's some evidence to suggest that the people who originally populated the west coast of Britain were of slightly different stock to those who populated the east. The eastern side people mainly came from continental Europe, but those on the west probably travelled through the Mediterranean, coming through the Iberian Peninsula. If you know anything significant about our history, the Irish component shouldn't be a big surprise to you, although perhaps quite how large it is might be a little bit of a surprise. Our culture, way of life and language is derived from that island. The traditional view is that the Irish settled Argyll round about the 6th century AD in a colony called Dalriada. They brought with them the Gaelic culture from Ireland, their language, and this gradually evolved into Gaelic in Scotland. To the Romans, the Irish were the Scotai, from whence we get the modern term Scotland. Although some people will assert that Gaelic was once spoken by the common people all over Scotland, this is unlikely in a geographical sense, but is true in the sense that the term Scotland once simply meant the place of the Irish, although Scotland at that time was a much smaller area than it is geographically now. Certainly by about the 15th century, it had retreated to its historical position in the Highlands, and also a lesser known enclave in Galloway in the southwest of Scotland. An interesting modern view of this situation by Dr. Ewan Campbell has it that Gaelic was spoken in Argyll basically from its arrival in the British Isles as a continuum with Ireland, and there is some circumstantial evidence to support this view from archaeology and from history. One should also remember that for a millennium after the establishment of Dalriada, there was free cultural and social exchange between the West Highlands and Ireland, and they formed a cultural continuum. Having said all this, we must be very careful about our interpretation of this Irish DNA signal. It is not a trace of a so-called Celtic ancestry or language, but rather, like the British signal, it predates this. The original Irish prehistoric population had the same origin as the British one, but as time went by it picked up some distinctive mutations, and this is what we are seeing. Some of these migrations will have happened in a time before Gaelic, Gaelic or Irish was established. Anyway, whatever interpretation we put on it, most native islanders seem to have this component at between 40 and 60% of their makeup. And in probably the majority of cases, it is the main part of the DNA. Let's have a look now at the so-called trace regions of the profile. One thing which might surprise you is the lack of Scandinavian influence in this, but this is not untypical for islanders. We roughly have DNA from Scandinavia in the range 1 to 6%. This tends to support the theory that the Norse formed more of a ruling elite on the islands, and probably mostly left when the islands were ceded to Scotland after the Battle of Largs and the resulting turmoil in the 1260s. We should note that this and most of the other trace regions have very low percentages, and if we look at the possible ranges of these, we see that the most that we can really say about any signal which is less than 10% of the DNA is that it comes from other European sources, and this can be confirmed by cross-checking these results with those of other companies. Now, we can actually follow this trail further back in time. I can load the data which I received from Ancestry DNA into a free processing site from a company called ChedMatch. To understand the results from here, you need to understand a little more about the DNA science and also about prehistory. But in this chart, we can see the influence of the Western and Eastern Mesolithic hunter-gatherers on my genome. These were the people who re-inhabited Europe and eventually Britain after the last ice age. And here as well we have the farmers from the Near East who brought a Neolithic revolution to Europe. But we can go even further back than this. However, to do this we have to turn to another company for results. This time it's one called 23andMe. This company includes both mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA in their analysis. Let's start with the Y chromosome. My type is labelled L1, and this essentially comes from Scandinavia. So although our Scandic roots don't come across very strongly in the general autosomal DNA profile, here they are writ large. However, one has to be very careful about overinterpreting this. This trace is essentially one ancestor in thousands. I've also had my maternal grandfather's Y chromosome analysed, and this produces by contrast an extremely Irish signal. Let's look now at the mitochondrial DNA. Mine comes from a group which is actually rather rare in Europe and in fact not particularly common anywhere, called L4. It seems to have originated during the last ice age in the far east of Europe or perhaps the west of Asia. Some people guess in the Ukraine. After the retreat of the last ice age, people left this refuge and spread out. So now it's found in Pakistan, Iran and neighbouring countries as well as in Europe. My particular strain travelled via the Baltic where it picked up some extra mutations. I've also had some other mitochondrial DNA analysed. My maternal grandfather's mitochondrial DNA is a more common type, originating in what is now the north of Italy. And by contrast, my paternal grandfather's is an interesting one, which originated to the north of the Caucasus. This is where the Indo-European languages may have originated, and it may have travelled with these to the west. From these lineages we can actually trace a path back to the cradle of all mankind in Africa, the original homeland. Finally, one last journey. The DNA shows traces of Neanderthal DNA, 2.7% in my case, from a time in the deepest antiquity when we shared the earth with other species of humans. When I got my first DNA profile done about 10 years ago, the technology was far more primitive than it is now, and the only types available were the mitochondrial and the Y chromosome. What I presented here is certainly not the end of the story. In a few years, full DNA sequencing will be available at a reasonable cost, and this will reveal even more of our story.